The entire terminal froze for a heartbeat. Then the tension snapped like a wire. Phones rose, heads swiveled, and whispers ricocheted off the polished floors. Andre Washington, broad-shouldered, suit sharp enough to reflect the overhead lights, held his elite pass in one hand and his passport in the other. "Sir, this ticket is clearly fraudulent," the manager, Gary, barked across the counter. Andre's eyes didn't flicker. Calm, collected, every inch the man who knew he belonged anywhere he walked. He responded evenly, "I assure you, there's a mistake. Please scan it." No scan, only the smirk of Susan, the agent with the tight blonde bun, who leaned forward, voice dripping with fake concern. "We might have a situation here," she said, loud enough for the growing circle of onlookers to hear. The crowd murmured, curiosity and judgment mixing into a tangible pressure, as if the air itself had thickened. Andre felt it, but he didn't flinch. Not a muscle betrayed him. And then came the first explosion. A passenger muttered under her breath, loud enough for others to catch. "How does he even get this seat?" Eyes darted, phones aimed, cameras clicked. He was suddenly a spectacle, a man being tried not for a crime, but for his very presence in a space they deemed impossible for him. Before Andre could respond, Susan leaned over again, this time whispering something to Gary. He nodded, theatrically serious. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify this." Step aside. The words hung like a guillotine. The first-class counter had transformed from polished luxury into a stage of public judgment, and Andre was center stage. The tension exploded again. Security officers stormed in, their boots clicking on tile, authority in every movement. Officer Peterson, the stern-faced man leading the team, squared up in front of Andre, hand hovering near his belt. "Sir, please comply," he said. The tone was professional, yet heavy, laden with the unspoken assumption that compliance was a given. The terminal felt smaller, the air hotter. Andre's jaw tightened. He was surrounded, humiliated, yet unbroken. But just when everyone expected resistance, a quiet, almost imperceptible twist shifted the balance. Andre's thumb brushed against his phone, sending a quick, cryptic message. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesticulate, didn't plead. Yet the calm in his eyes, the stillness of his posture, sent an unspoken shock through the room. This was no ordinary passenger, and this was no ordinary ticket. Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do, with the world watching, and realized that standing still might be the most powerful thing you could do? That's exactly where Andre was now. For a moment, silence fell over the crowd. Whispers softened. Phone stayed ready. The drama of the public accusation had reached a boiling point, but no one knew the real story yet. Who was this man who could command calm in a storm of humiliation? Why did his presence seem to make people so uncomfortable, so determined to disbelieve the obvious? Andre cleared his throat softly, eyes fixed on Gary, who now looked slightly unsettled. "Please scan the pass," he repeated, voice still controlled, still steady. The words were simple, but in them was an unshakable authority. Yet Susan and Gary exchanged glances, a hint of panic behind the practiced mask of superiority. The power dynamic had shifted subtly, imperceptibly, but unmistakably. Outside the frame of the counter, the crowd leaned in, drawn into the tension, unaware that they were witnessing the prelude to something far larger. Phones continued recording, whispers turned to gossip, and the murmurs of disbelief started to blend with anticipation. Every eye followed Andre, the man publicly accused, quietly asserting his right to exist in a space designed to exclude him. And then, just as the murmurs began to swell, Andre's phone buzzed again. This time, a message appeared on the screen that no one could see, a trigger that would soon flip the entire terminal on its head. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. But in that silence, the story had already taken a turn no one saw coming. The question now, hanging in the air like smoke over the terminal, was simple. What happens when the man everyone assumes is powerless is actually holding all the cards? Andre held out the sleek black Elite Pass, letting the light catch its embossed logo. He flipped open his passport and laid his reservation confirmation across the counter, every document pristine, every detail verified. "All of this is valid," he said, voice steady, eyes unwavering. "If you scan the pass, you'll see it's real." But Susan, arms crossed, barely glanced at the papers. Her lips curled into that same smirk, the one that made everyone watching feel like they were witnessing something performative rather than professional. "Clearly, this is fake," she said, voice loud enough for the crowd to lean in to notice every word. Gary nodded, shaking his head with exaggerated disbelief. "We do these random checks for operational necessity," he added, as if those words could mask the thrill of humiliating him in front of first-class passengers. Andre's fingers tapped lightly on the countertop. He didn't raise his voice, didn't plead, didn't let emotion creep in. Yet every second of his calmness seemed to ignite the tension further. The murmurs around him grew louder, some shocked, some incredulous, others whispering assumptions about the man daring to stand his ground. Cameras and phones followed every subtle gesture, every sharp glance. Susan leaned closer, her voice dropping so only Andre could hear, or so she thought. "Are you sure you can afford this seat?" The question was sharp, dismissive, and loaded with judgment. The kind of question that wasn't really about money, but about who belonged and who didn't. Andre raised an eyebrow, letting the silence answer. Not a word escaped him. He didn't have to speak. The calm in his posture, the quiet authority in his presence, spoke louder than any retort could. Gary, sensing the rising unease among bystanders, tried to assert control again. "Sir, if you don't step aside while we verify these documents, we'll have to call security," he said, voice booming, a mix of threat and theater. The crowd shifted, some looking worried, some excited, waiting for the next move, for a crack in Andre's composure that never came. And that's when Andre did something almost imperceptible. He leaned slightly forward and let his eyes meet Susan's. No words, just a look that hinted at experience, control, and patience honed over decades in boardrooms where people underestimated him at their own risk. The look alone made her hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, but that fraction was enough to shift the weight in the room, unnoticed by most but felt by anyone paying attention. Still, the official line continued. "Random checks, operational necessity," they repeated, as if chanting it would make the absurdity acceptable. Phones captured every syllable, every microaggression, every moment of quiet defiance. Passengers were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a ticket. It was about a man being denied his dignity because of an unspoken hierarchy no one dared question, except Andre. And then, just as Susan waved her hand dismissively at the documents again, Andre's phone vibrated softly in his pocket. A small, almost invisible movement, but one that would soon set the next stage into motion. He didn't touch it, didn't react, but the room, though unaware, was on the edge of witnessing a shift that no one could have predicted. The question now lingered in the air, as sharp as the first class lighting overhead. How far would they push before they realized they were no longer in control? The buzz of the terminal shifted as the words, "Escort him out," carried across the counter. Gary's booming voice wasn't just an announcement, it was a performance. He wanted everyone to hear, to see, to believe that Andre Washington was nothing more than a fraud who had no business in first class. And then came the boots. The sharp click of polished shoes against tile cut through the murmurs. Security entered in formation, 3 officers fanning out with quiet precision. At their center was Officer Peterson, a broad man with a heavy jaw and the kind of posture that spoke of authority before he even opened his mouth. His eyes scanned the scene, calculating, rehearsed, another day, another situation. Passengers gasped softly, some whispering, others raising their phones higher. A black man in a navy blue suit, papers in hand, standing against a wall of uniforms. It looked like guilt before a single fact had been proven. That's how the scene was staged. That's how they wanted it to look. Gary straightened, puffing his chest as though the arrival of Peterson's team confirmed his judgment. "This gentleman has presented fraudulent documents," he declared, gesturing toward Andre with a practiced authority. "We need him escorted immediately." The word fraudulent echoed louder than the overhead announcements. It wasn't just a label. It was a sentence spoken before any evidence was weighed. Susan crossed her arms and smirked, shifting slightly so she could watch the crowd's reaction. She thrived on the spectacle, the whispers, the way people's eyes narrowed with suspicion. To her, this wasn't about a boarding pass. It was about teaching someone where they did or didn't belong. Andre stood motionless, his expression unreadable. He wasn't begging. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't even raising his voice. That calm, almost unnerving restraint filled the space more than Gary's theatrics or Susan's smirk. It made the crowd lean in closer, waiting for him to snap or for the officers to pounce. Officer Peterson finally stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Sir, I'll need you to comply." His tone was even, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Resistance would not be tolerated. The other officers shifted slightly, hands brushing their belts, ready for escalation. A woman in line whispered, "Why don't they just scan the card?" Another man hissed back, "Because it's fake, can't you see?" The division was palpable. Half the witnesses questioned the scene. The other half accepted it as truth simply because of who was being accused. Andre's fingers tightened around his documents, but he didn't move. Not a single flinch. The tension sharpened. The silence between his calm and their aggression stretched thin, like glass about to shatter. For a moment, it seemed inevitable. Peterson would take him by the arm, the other officers would close in, and Andre would be paraded through the terminal like a criminal. Phones would capture the walk of shame. Clips would go viral, not for justice, but for humiliation. But then Peterson hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, something flickered across his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe recognition, maybe doubt. It was gone almost as quickly as it came, buried under the weight of duty. Yet that pause was enough to shift the air, enough to hint that this was not going to end the way Gary or Susan thought. And as Peterson drew one step closer, Andre raised his chin, calm as stone, and whispered a line no one around him could quite catch. The crowd leaned in, phones recording, hearts pounding, because whatever he had just said was about to change everything. The terminal seemed to shrink around Andre, the first-class counter now a stage, the fluorescent lights glaring down like spotlights. Every eye was fixed on him, phones pointed like tiny weapons ready to capture a moment they believed would shame him. Susan's smirk had widened, and Gary had adopted a posture that screamed finality. There would be no second chances here. "Sir," Gary barked, voice tight with self-importance, "we're asking you to leave this area immediately. Your ticket is invalid. If you refuse, security will escort you." The words weren't just instructions. They were an attempt to break him publicly, a declaration that his presence was unacceptable. Andre's hands remained at his sides, clutching his documents, but not raising them in protest. His breath was steady, almost hypnotic, as though he were aware of a rhythm no one else could feel, the rhythm of control, of patience, of a power most people ignored until it was too late. He met Gary's gaze evenly, a calm force pressing against the tidal wave of authority trying to sweep him away. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath. Whispers and murmurs collided with the metallic squeak of rolling luggage. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or just watch. Others leaned closer, their phones capturing the tension, the injustice, the slow burn of humiliation. "Is he actually going to get kicked out?" A woman muttered under her breath, eyes wide. Susan tilted her head, like a predator sizing up prey. "Maybe if he steps aside quietly, we can all move on," she said, voice soft but cruel, dripping with that rare combination of entitlement and arrogance. The words weren't addressed to Andre. They were a performance for the spectators, a cruel little play meant to entertain. Andre didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He didn't even tighten his grip on the elite pass, which now felt like more than a ticket. It was a symbol, a quiet promise of authority waiting to be claimed. He inhaled once, the sound almost imperceptible, but somehow enough to make the officers pause, to make Susan's smirk twitch ever so slightly. The officers shifted, one foot tapping, hands hovering near their belts. Peterson's eyes never left Andre, studying, calculating, sensing that the man before him wasn't a criminal, wasn't someone to coerce easily. And for a fleeting moment, the entire atmosphere of the terminal changed. The crowd's anticipation, the agent's certainty, the authority in uniform, all began to falter under the weight of Andre's calm defiance. A young man in line whispered, "Why won't he just move?" The answer was clear, though unspoken. Moving would mean giving in, would validate the humiliation, would let the system win. Andre wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. He stood his ground like a fortress, composed yet unyielding, the very image of quiet power in a world that refused to recognize it. Time seemed to stretch. Every second felt loaded with meaning. Every eye locked, every phone recording the unfolding drama. The terminal was no longer just a place of departure and arrival. It was a battlefield, the invisible lines of race, class, and entitlement drawn in plain sight. And then came the subtle shift, almost imperceptible. Officer Peterson leaned slightly, whispering something into the ear of his colleague. The words were hushed, but the glance that followed carried weight. For the first time, someone in uniform seemed uncertain. For the first time, the unwavering certainty of authority had a crack. Andre's lips curved into the tiniest hint of a smile, one that no one except perhaps Peterson noticed. The silence that followed was deafening. Every spectator, every employee, every officer felt it, the calm before the storm. Because in that pause, something unspoken and dangerous was about to happen. And as Gary raised his voice again, preparing to assert control one final time, Andre's hand moved, almost invisibly, toward his pocket. The subtle motion was enough to make Peterson's eyes widen, and enough to hint that the humiliation, the spectacle, and the power struggle were far from over. Andre's fingers moved almost imperceptibly, reaching into the inner pocket of his suit. The terminal buzzed around him, phone still recording, murmurs growing louder, the tension thick enough to choke on, but he didn't flinch. He didn't shout, he didn't argue. He simply withdrew a sleek black phone, the kind most people reserve for private, important calls. The gesture was subtle, almost casual, but to anyone paying attention, it was the calmest declaration of power the room had seen. He tapped a few keys and held the phone close to his ear, his expression unreadable. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet yet precise, a contrast so sharp it cut through the noise of chaos. "It's time," he said, low and measured. Nothing more. No explanation. No pleading, no anger. Just a single sentence that carried the weight of inevitability. The people around him noticed, though most didn't understand. Susan tilted her head, frowning now, her earlier smirk faltering as she exchanged a glance with Gary. "Who is he talking to?" Gary muttered, his confidence cracking just enough to betray unease. The crowd murmured in speculation. "Is that the CEO?" someone whispered. "No, he can't be." But even without knowing the name or the title, everyone felt the shift. The energy in the terminal changed. The whispered anticipation of public humiliation began to waver, replaced by a subtle tension, the kind that happens when someone in control is underestimated for too long. Andre didn't need to raise his voice or display authority. The air itself seemed to acknowledge him, the room bending quietly under the gravity of a man who refused to panic. A child tugged at their mother's sleeve nearby, wide-eyed. "Mom, why are they scared of him?" The mother whispered back, uncertain. Around them, phones continued to record, but the narrative had subtly shifted. The story was no longer just about a black man being denied his rightful place. It was about the invisible hand pulling strings behind the scenes, a hint of a hidden ace in the deck. And then, just as quickly as the call began, Andre ended it, sliding the phone back into his pocket. His calm didn't break. But now, a question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. Who exactly had he just called? And how far would that single, quiet signal reach before the consequences hit? The moment Andre, slipped his phone back into his suit. The ripple of tension in Terminal 4 shifted into something almost electric. Phones were already recording, but now the energy around him felt different, like watching a slow-motion storm about to break. Within minutes, passengers began uploading clips, their captions short, biting, furious. Black man denied first class with valid ticket. This is what racism looks like at JFK. Every upload added fuel to a fire that was spreading faster than anyone at the counter could control. The hashtag elite while black began a trend almost instantly. Comments poured in from people who had never stepped foot in Terminal 4, but could feel the injustice burning through the screen. Imagine being told you don't belong in first class because of the color of your skin, one tweet read, and doing everything right, ticket, ID, confirmation, and still getting humiliated. This is madness. Another, this isn't just about one flight. This is about the system deciding who deserves dignity. Meanwhile, the onlookers in the terminal were caught in a strange loop of shame and curiosity. Some had been laughing, whispering among themselves, recording for TikTok or Instagram. Now, many of them froze, realizing they were part of something bigger than themselves, witnesses to a viral moment that no amount of smirks or fake authority could erase. People whispered, "Who is he really? There's something about him." The murmur grew into a collective awareness. This wasn't just another passenger dispute. Airport staff scurried, unsure how to respond. Susan's smirk faltered completely, her earlier confidence cracking as the reality of viral accountability sank in. Gary tried to regain control, raising his voice, but even he could see the tide turning. Each new clip uploaded seemed to tighten the net of scrutiny around him, the terminal walls suddenly feeling smaller, the world watching. Beyond the airport, the footage spread like wildfire. Influencers dissected every frame. Commentators broke down Andre's body language, the calm, unshakable demeanor, the quiet precision in his gestures. Analysts debated the airline's policies, the operational necessity, excuse, and the microaggressions layered into each word and look. The story became more than humiliation. It was a lesson in power, perception, and prejudice. And then, just when the online storm was peaking, a single detail in one video caught the eye of a security professional watching from a remote office. A name flashed on Andre's ID in the reflection of a phone screen, one that made him freeze in disbelief. The world was watching, yes, but someone in the chain of authority had just realized that this viral outrage was only the surface. The question hung like a thundercloud over Terminal 4. How far would this wave of exposure reach? And was everyone ready for the truth hidden behind that calm, navy blue suit? Officer Peterson squinted at the reflection of Andre's elite pass in the phone screen. Something about the way the light hit the embossed letters made him pause, heart skipping. He had seen countless IDs, countless tickets, countless passengers, but something felt different this time. He blinked, leaned closer, and then froze. The name there, plain and unmistakable, jolted a memory he had tried to shake off all morning. A company-wide memo, sent before dawn, one of those important for all staff, alerts no one really reads unless they have to. Peterson's fingers tightened around the edge of the badge scanner. Andre Washington, CEO of the parent company that now controlled American Falcon Airlines. Suddenly, the entire scene warped in Peterson's mind. The smirk on Susan's face, Gary's loud proclamations, the way every onlooker had been leaning in, waiting for a black man to stumble. The sheer audacity of the assumption that this ticket could be fake. And Peterson realized he had almost participated in it, almost treated his new boss like a criminal. The weight of it pressed against him, a suffocating, sharp realization of how close he had come to disgrace. Peterson's eyes darted from Andre to Susan, who was still whispering to Gary, unaware that the tides had already shifted. Gary's booming voice faltered for a split second as Peterson cleared his throat, a small, controlled sound, but one that carried an authority no one there expected. "Excuse me," Peterson said, his voice tight, measured, almost hesitant, but with an edge that made the air tremble. "Sir, may I have your attention for a moment?" Andre looked up slowly, calm as ever, the faintest hint of a knowing smile tugging at his lips. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The room held its breath. Phones still recording, passengers still whispering, but the dynamic had already changed. Peterson stepped closer, scanning Andre's pass again, making a show of verification, but the disbelief in his eyes betrayed him. He had just realized the truth. The man he had been called to remove was the architect of the very system he served. The murmurs in the crowd shifted, subtle at first, then louder, as if the energy in the terminal sensed the revelation before it even reached the speakers. "Wait, he's the CEO?" someone whispered. That's him." Another passenger shook their head, disbelief lacing their voice. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every micro-expression, every glance, every faltering step of authority as reality dawned on everyone. Andre straightened, as if the moment had been orchestrated for him all along. Every pause, every breath, every tense second feeding into the inevitable revelation. His calmness wasn't just composure. It was dominance disguised as patience, power hidden in plain sight. Peterson's stance softened, respect replacing suspicion, but the tension didn't vanish. Not yet. The people around them were still watching, still wondering, and the story they had witnessed moments ago was now escalating into something no one could ignore. And then, just as Andre lifted his phone again, a single, sharp ping echoed across the terminal, a call that would change everything. Peterson's eyes widened, realization settling in like ice water. This wasn't just exposure. This wasn't just humiliation reversed. Something bigger was about to unfold, something that would ripple far beyond Terminal 4. The moment Peterson's voice cut through the terminal, the world inside JFK, Terminal 4, tilted on its axis. Susan's smirk faltered, her confidence cracking like glass under pressure. Gary's booming authority faltered into a strangled cough as the realization settled in. They were no longer orchestrating humiliation. They were standing in the eye of a storm they hadn't seen coming. Phones still in hand, passengers whispered feverishly, their eyes darting between Andre and the flailing staff. Every second stretched longer than the last, pregnant with disbelief and dawning shame. But while the terminal buzzed, another storm erupted far from the gate, one that no one on the floor yet saw. The instant Peterson muttered Andre Washington's name, alerts pinged across executive phones, notifications flashing with urgency and disbelief. Legal teams were already awake, though most had been asleep hours earlier, not expecting their Monday morning to begin with the chaos of humiliation gone viral. The memo that once seemed mundane now sparked emergency protocols. Andre Washington, CEO of the parent company, had been publicly accused, questioned, and almost removed from his rightful first-class seat. Executives picked up lines they had ignored hours earlier. A junior assistant on a bridge call whispered hurriedly, voice trembling, "Sir, you need to see this. It's already on every feed. Terminal 4. The words barely formed before the panic spread. Phones rang in offices across cities. Meeting rooms emptied, and private jets queued for rapid departures. Every legal, communications, and security advisor scrambled to assess, contain, and anticipate the fallout. "How was this happening?" one executive hissed. "How could this happen under our watch?" Back at the terminal, Susan and Gary remained, unaware that the ground beneath them was collapsing faster than they could process. They continued their performance, their gestures sharp and condescending, pretending to maintain authority over a man whose power dwarfed anything they could imagine. They had no idea that every moment of mockery was being documented, replayed, and dissected across devices owned by people who understood influence, leverage, and consequence far better than they did. Andre stood, unshaken, the calm of a storm's center radiating from him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't wave his hands, didn't need to. His presence alone altered the room's energy, a quiet power that contrasted sharply with the chaos swirling above in corporate offices. Executives, on the other end of lines and video feeds, began to realize the true magnitude of the miscalculation. They weren't watching an angry passenger. They weren't watching a mistake. They were witnessing the unfolding of a reckoning, slow and precise, with consequences that could ripple through the airline and beyond. A flight attendant paused mid-step, watching Andre's stillness and Peterson's hesitant compliance. Cameras kept rolling, capturing micro-expressions, whispers, and subtle shifts of control. Somewhere in a corner, a lawyer typed furiously, drafting emergency directives that had to be approved before the news spiraled further. The industry, usually calm behind polished facades and operational routines, began to sense tremors, an unraveling of control that none could have anticipated. And then came the first direct communication, a short, urgent call buzzing on Andre's phone. He glanced at it, thumb hovering over the screen, the faintest smirk hinting at an escalation yet to come. The room didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had shifted completely. Susan and Gary remained trapped in their ignorance, and the executives scrambling miles away had no idea the storm they faced was already in motion. One call from Andre could change everything. Andre Washington's calm had become a weapon. The murmurs of passengers, the murmurs of disbelief, even the once dominant voices of Susan and Gary, all of it faded into a background hum. He held his phone in one hand, the other resting lightly on the counter, like a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, yet made it appear effortless. No raised voice, no overt display of anger, just control. The kind of control that radiates in a room and makes even the loudest doubters pause. The line connected instantly. On the other side, phones rang off the hook in boardrooms, offices, and private residences. Junior assistants whispered urgent notes. Legal advisors leaned over shoulders, and executives in silk suits and expensive ties felt a creeping panic they couldn't suppress. The reality was sinking in. The man standing before them at Terminal 4, who moments ago had been mocked and threatened, was the one holding all the cards. "Good morning," Andre said, voice steady, almost conversational. "Yes, this is Andre Washington. I believe you've seen the video." His tone carried neither apology nor aggression. It was the kind of certainty that bends situations to your will. "I want a full report on every incident similar to what just occurred here. I want names, times, and all supporting evidence delivered to me within the hour. And yes, we will be addressing this immediately." The executives on the other end felt a chill. Normally, they issue directives. Normally, they set rules. And now, for the first time in years, the rules were no longer theirs to define. Andre's phrasing left no room for negotiation. There was no polite request, no hint of uncertainty. He spoke as though he had already anticipated every objection, every excuse, every rationalization. Back at the counter, Susan stiffened. Gary's mouth opened, then closed, unsure what to say. Peterson, the officer who had stopped mid-step when realizing Andre's identity, now subtly nodded, a silent acknowledgement that the weight of authority had shifted completely. The crowd of onlookers sensed it too. The energy in the terminal changed. What had started as a spectacle of humiliation transformed into a quiet, electrifying tension. Everyone understood. Something monumental was unfolding, and they were witnessing the reversal firsthand. Andre continued, each word precise. "We will implement mandatory bias training. We will revise operational procedures immediately. And anyone who fails to comply or continues these patterns of behavior will be held accountable. Discretion, experience, operational necessity. These are not excuses for prejudice. They are responsibilities you have failed to meet." Even the passengers felt the impact. Phones lowered slightly, whispers hushed, and a sense of vindication grew. Here was a man who had been placed in an impossible position, standing tall while the very system that sought to humiliate him trembled. The silence following his statements was heavier than any applause. It was a pause pregnant with inevitability. Andre had not just taken control, he had redefined it. Gary finally cleared his throat, a weak attempt at asserting dominance. But Andre didn't flinch. He simply held the phone, eyes calm, posture unyielding. Every executive listening knew that any argument, any complaint, any defensive justification would be irrelevant. The power had shifted, and it had shifted completely. And yet, Andre didn't raise his voice or threaten. His restraint was part of the strategy, a quiet, unshakable authority that made fear palpable. Those who once laughed at him now understood that every sarcastic word, every dismissive glance had been a miscalculation of epic proportions. They were no longer the arbiters of the moment. They were witnesses to a reckoning. The final words from Andre were almost casual, but the impact was seismic. Ensure this never happens again. And if it does, remember, you've seen what discretion and power look like in action. I suggest you take this seriously. He ended the call, placing the phone down on the counter with the softest click, a sound that felt louder than any shouted command. The terminal was frozen. Susan, Gary, Peterson, and every passenger watched as Andre's presence filled the space, unchallenged and undeniable. But as the collective realization set in, a new tension began to ripple, a question that none could ignore. If he had already flipped the power so completely with just a call, what was he planning next? And would it be enough to shatter the system entirely? Andre's phone call ended, but the energy in the terminal didn't dissipate. If anything, it thickened, charged with a mix of awe, curiosity, and a simmering tension no one could ignore. He stood at the counter, eyes scanning the crowd, not with arrogance, but with a quiet understanding of the weight of what had just happened. The audience of strangers, staff, and security weren't just spectators. They were witnesses to the unveiling of a deeper truth. He began speaking again, this time not to executives, but aloud to everyone within earshot, his voice calm, but carrying a force that demanded attention. What just happened here isn't an isolated incident, Andre said. It's a reflection of a system built on assumptions, on biases, and on the comfortable ignorance of those in positions of authority. This humiliation, this disbelief that a black man could hold power or occupy space in first class. This is the pattern. Passengers leaned forward instinctively, phones forgotten for a moment. Some whispered agreements. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The air of exclusivity and operational pretense that had seemed untouchable only minutes before was now being questioned openly, dissected in real time. Andre didn't just point fingers. He painted a portrait of systemic failure, one that had affected countless others before him, ones whose voices had been silenced or ignored. He referenced subtle but familiar patterns, the random scrutiny, the microaggressions, the fake procedural checks that always seemed to target people who looked like him. How many times has someone shown their ticket, their ID, their proof of payment, only to be told they don't belong? How many times has discretion been weaponized to enforce prejudice under the guise of operational necessity? His words weren't accusations. They were indictments, precise and unflinching. Andre's calm delivery made it even more devastating. There was no shouting, no flailing, no begging for recognition. The strength came from control, from clarity, from the exposure of truth. He knew that the system relied on performance, on quiet acceptance, on those too intimidated to call out. And now, for the first time, someone was naming it publicly, right in the heart of the theater where the injustice had just played out. Security officers, still present, exchanged glances. Peterson, who had already seen the truth about Andre's identity, subtly nodded to his team, as if to say, "This is bigger than the individual, bigger than protocol. It's systemic." Passengers murmured, some recording, some silently questioning everything they had accepted as normal. Andre continued, layering facts with subtle provocation. "This isn't just about me. It's about the invisible barriers, the unspoken rules that have kept people like me out of spaces where we belong. It's about a culture that tolerates humiliation and normalizes discrimination, then calls it operational procedure. We've all seen it, quietly, repeatedly, and without consequence. Until now." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The pause was deafening. A moment of reflection for everyone present. staff, passengers, executives who were still listening in, and even Susan and Gary, who finally seemed to understand that the ground beneath them had shifted in ways they hadn't anticipated. The humiliation they had orchestrated had been flipped, and now the narrative was out of their control. Then Andre's tone sharpened, just slightly, enough to pierce the lingering tension. The system that allowed this to happen is fragile. It can be changed or it can collapse. But understand this: silence, denial, or excuses will no longer protect it. For the first time since the confrontation began, there was a collective intake of breath. The audience, both immediate and digital, realized that the moment had transcended first-class seats, boarding procedures, or even one man's dignity. The confrontation had exposed a blueprint of injustice, and the question on everyone's mind was inevitable. Now that the system had been named, who would be brave enough to answer? And what would happen next? Andre's hand hovered briefly over his phone, pausing before he made the next call. Then, with the same calm precision he had shown throughout the chaos, he dialed the numbers that would reach the highest offices of American Falcon Airlines. As the line connected, every person nearby seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The air in Terminal 4 shifted, charged with anticipation. The laughter and smirks of Susan and Gary had vanished, replaced by a nervous tightness. They weren't sure whether to watch, to run, or to pretend they didn't notice that the world had tilted. "Good afternoon," Andre began, his voice smooth but unwavering. "I'm calling regarding a failure in operational judgment, discriminatory practices, and systemic neglect that cannot continue." He didn't pause for pleasantries, didn't ask permission to speak. He was in command, and everyone listening understood that instinctively. He listed each incident with surgical clarity, citing patterns, repeated failures, and microaggressions that had gone unaddressed. Every word hit like a pulse of electricity, a quiet thunderclap in the corporate channels. "I am issuing an ultimatum," he said, the phrase slicing through the tension like a blade. "Immediate reforms must be enacted. All staff undergo bias training, procedures for first-class verification revised, accountability measures enforced, and public acknowledgement of these failures issued. Failure to comply will leave the airline no alternative but to cease operations." Silence followed. It was heavy, filled with disbelief and fear. The executives on the other end of the line, previously secure in their towers of authority, suddenly understood the precariousness of their positions. The voice of one man, calm, black, resolute, had exposed how fragile their control really was. Every delay, every excuse, every rationalization of operational necessity evaporated in the face of the ultimatum. Passengers at the counter watched as Andre's subtle gestures signaled not arrogance, but the confidence of someone who knew power ran deeper than procedure. Phones recorded again, but this time the story was different. This was no longer a viral moment of humiliation. It was a viral display of authority, restraint, and accountability. Even Susan and Gary froze, sensing that their performance of control had collapsed entirely. Andre didn't shout. He didn't threaten in the conventional sense. The power came from the combination of clarity, leverage, and visibility. Each word mapped a path that either led to reform or total collapse, and everyone who could hear understood that there was no middle ground. The airline had been given a choice, and Andre held all the cards. He concluded the call with the same measured tone he had started with. "The timeline is immediate. No exceptions. Consider this the last opportunity to correct a system that has failed so many. The consequences of inaction will be irreversible." He hung up. The silence in Terminal 4 was palpable. Even the murmurs of passengers seemed restrained, as if the very walls of the terminal had absorbed the weight of what had just occurred. The room fell into a heavy, almost unbearable silence. The board of American Falcon Airlines sat frozen, the weight of Andre Washington's presence pressing down on every executive in the space. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to gesture dramatically. Power, in his hands, was subtle, deliberate, and absolute. His calm alone shifted the balance in the room. a quiet hurricane that left no doubt who was in control. Minutes stretched like hours. Phones rested on the table, some still recording, some muted, all irrelevant. Susan and Gary's earlier arrogance had evaporated into thin air. The board's faces betrayed panic, their carefully constructed authority crumbling under the knowledge that the man before them could enforce every word of his ultimatum. No negotiations, no compromises. Every demand laid out was now non-negotiable, and the consequences of defiance were clear. One of the senior board members, a man used to command, shifted in his seat. He leaned toward his colleague and whispered, his voice tight with panic, "He's not bluffing. He can ground the entire fleet by lunchtime. We have no leverage." The other man's face was ashen. He gave a short, sharp nod. The realization rippled across the table. Their carefully constructed authority had crumbled. Defiance meant ruin. One by one, shoulders slumped. The surrender wasn't a single act, but a wave of defeated gestures. The airline's board was folding to avoid total collapse. Andre's restraint was disarming. He didn't gloat. He didn't issue threats. There was no triumphant outburst, just the quiet satisfaction of a man who had let the system reveal its own weaknesses. Outside, passengers and staff could feel it too. The subtle shift in energy, the way Susan and Gary's expressions twisted into a mixture of fear and disbelief, spoke louder than any announcement ever could. Justice, when served, didn't always require a spectacle. Sometimes it arrived like a wave, silent and unstoppable, reshaping the landscape in ways no one could ignore. Andre turned slightly, scanning the room. The board had agreed to implement sweeping reforms, root out discriminatory practices, and hold staff accountable. Their written acknowledgement was already being prepared. He allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Power, true power, had been exercised without a single shout. And in that restraint, he had made an example not just for Susan and Gary, but for the entire airline industry. It was over, at least for now. The immediate threat had been neutralized, humiliation had been addressed, and the company had been forced into accountability. Andre's presence, calm yet commanding, had ensured that dignity was restored, not through chaos, but through the quiet certainty of authority. And yet, even in victory, there was tension in the air, a recognition that change would take time to solidify, that eyes would watch, and that the stakes remained high in an industry built on hierarchy and hidden biases. But for the moment, Andre Washington had turned humiliation into triumph. The surrender was complete. The room exhaled collectively, a silent acknowledgement that history had been made and that one man's poise had rewritten the rules of engagement in elite spaces. The moment the board signed off, a ripple ran through the terminal that felt almost tangible. Susan froze, her fingers hovering over the counter as if she were about to press some invisible button that could reverse reality itself. Gary's jaw went slack. Neither had anticipated the totality of what had just happened. In a single, quiet sweep, the rules had been rewritten, and their little performance of power was exposed for what it truly was: weak, hollow, and utterly irrelevant. Within minutes, human resources swooped in. Their faces were a mix of pity and professional necessity, but there was no room for negotiation. Susan's smirk had vanished. Gary's mock authority dissolved. Both were escorted away, the terminations final, public, and immediate. Passengers, who had been holding their breath since the confrontation began, erupted in whispered applause that grew louder with each step the two agents took toward the exit. Phones still recorded, capturing the irony and the instant justice unfolding for millions online in real time. Corporate released a statement moments later, crisp and measured, but unmistakably contrite. American Falcon Airlines deeply regrets the events at JFK Terminal 4. Discrimination of any kind is unacceptable. Immediate action has been taken to correct this. The words, typed and posted within the hour, felt almost like a release valve for the tension. But in reality, the real victory had already played out before anyone clicked refresh. Andre's calm, deliberate authority had done what press releases could never achieve alone. It had forced accountability in the moment, in full view of the public and without a hint of self-aggrandizement. Passengers approached Andre cautiously at first, smiles breaking, some extending hands, others whispering words of admiration or relief. "That was incredible," one woman said, her voice trembling. "I've never seen anyone stay so composed." A young man with a camera said, "I'm uploading this right now. The world needs to see this." It was more than recognition. It was acknowledgement that someone had dismantled prejudice with quiet precision, that dignity could win in a space built to strip it away. And Andre remained as he had throughout, composed, assured, and intentionally understated. He didn't linger for praise or take the spotlight. Every glance, every nod, every quiet acknowledgement of gratitude reinforced a single truth. Power didn't always need to roar to be undeniable. The entire terminal felt different now, as though the very air had shifted, heavier with respect and the lingering embarrassment of those who had once wielded it carelessly. But even in this triumph, there was an undercurrent of tension, subtle yet persistent. The story had already gone viral, clips circulating, hashtags trending, discussions igniting. What seemed like an ending was in reality just the first wave of a larger reckoning, one that could touch every terminal, every airline, every moment someone dared judge by appearance rather than merit. Andre adjusted his suit jacket, eyes sweeping the room one last time. Justice had been served, yet the crowd's energy reminded him that vigilance was never optional in spaces designed for the elite. As he turned to leave the terminal, a subtle hum of curiosity and anticipation followed him, watching, waiting, questioning what would happen next. Because in a world built on hidden hierarchies and silent biases, calm authority was only the beginning, and the next wave of consequences was already forming. Entire airline industry. Executives across multiple carriers sat in high-rise offices staring at their screens, watching clips of Terminal 4 go viral, and realizing that the old ways of discretion and operational necessity had been exposed for what they truly were, mechanisms to protect prejudice, to humiliate without consequence. The hashtag Elite While Black had spread beyond social media. Tweets, TikToks, even local news channels carried the story, dissecting every second of Andre Washington's composed, unflinching stance. Across the country, Black travelers shared stories that had long been silenced. A flight attendant in Los Angeles wrote about how a passenger with too much confidence had once been questioned for carrying a first-class boarding pass. In Chicago, a businessman posted that he had quietly recorded multiple incidents of profiling but never dared to confront the system. Each story, each confession, amplified the pressure. Andre's act became more than a single victory. It was proof that dignity could demand accountability, even in spaces designed to ignore it. Meanwhile, Airline scrambled. Internal emails leaked, showing hurried memos sent to staff. Review anti-bias policies immediately. Mandatory sensitivity training effective next week. Boards of other carriers called emergency meetings, suddenly aware that silence or ignorance would no longer be an option. Operational procedures that had been justified as random checks were now being questioned in terms of legality and morality. Executives who had relied on quiet power were now facing the reality that the public had a lens, and it was unblinking. In airports across the nation, passengers watched differently. Eyes lingered on the counters, on staff interactions, on the subtle hierarchies that were often invisible. Those who had long tolerated minor humiliations began whispering to friends, "Did you see that video? We have to call this out." The idea that one person's calm authority could flip an entire system inspired a wave of subtle activism, a digital community unified by observation, outrage, and hope. Andre's singular act became a blueprint. You could enforce dignity without shouting. You could demand change without violence. You could turn humiliation into leverage. But even as reforms were announced and videos celebrated, there was a tension that hung in the air. The industry had blinked, but blinked under pressure, not voluntarily. Hidden networks of privilege, People who still assumed their authority was untouchable were now quietly recalibrating. Questions lingered. Who would be next? Which airports, which airlines would resist or find loopholes? The story of Andre Washington was no longer just a moment at JFK. It had become a living cautionary tale, spreading faster than anyone could control. As Andre walked away from the terminal, unnoticed by most, but felt by all, the ripple of his actions extended far beyond any single flight. The landscape had shifted, but the next confrontation, the one that would test whether this change was genuine or performative, was already forming, just out of sight. Because in elite spaces, power is always tested, and one calm victory today could be the spark for a storm tomorrow. The moment the news broke, it wasn't just American Falcon feeling the tremors. It was the 3 weeks had passed since the chaos at JFK, and the atmosphere at American Falcon Airlines was noticeably different. Andre Washington approached the first-class check-in counter with the same quiet confidence, the smooth black card of his elite pass glinting in his hand. But this time, there was no tension, no suspicious glances, no whispered doubts. Where once there had been a performance of disbelief and judgment, there was now calm professionalism and genuine acknowledgement. The employees had learned, through his calm, decisive action, that disrespect carried consequences, and the rules of power had subtly shifted in the airline's hallways and break rooms. As he stepped forward, the clerk greeted him warmly, eyes meeting his with respect rather than skepticism. Flight attendants passed by, nodding politely, offering assistance without a second glance at his race or status. Andre moved through the line, noting subtle changes. Other passengers no longer stared. No phones appeared mid-confrontation. No hushed comments followed him. The whispers of disbelief and smirks that had once defined his experience were gone, replaced with a quiet understanding. His presence was no longer a spectacle, but a reminder. When dignity is enforced, even the smallest spaces transform. Andre's mind drifted back to that day, when Susan and Gary had mocked him openly, their authority bolstered by systemic biases. He remembered the shock on Officer Peterson's face, the viral videos, the Twitter storm, the legal team scrambling, and the board folding under his restraint. All of it had led to this, a new normal that felt fragile yet promising, a shift visible in the smiles of employees and the subtle courtesies extended to every passenger. The elite pass, once a symbol of privilege, had now become a symbol of accountability and respect. He settled into his seat, the leather cool beneath him, the cabin quiet except for the low hum of the engines. As the plane taxied toward the runway, he looked around and noticed the new energy. Passengers chatting politely with attendants, staff moving efficiently without condescension, and the subtle but unmistakable sense that standards had changed. No one needed to announce it. The culture shift was evident in behavior, in tone, in the way people treated each other. Andre had turned humiliation into a lesson, and the lesson had stuck. Yet he knew the work was far from over. Racism didn't vanish in 3 weeks, and entitlement didn't disappear overnight. Biases could hide, policies could be bypassed, and complacency could return if vigilance slipped. But the ripples from his action were undeniable. Social media still buzzed with clips of that infamous moment, now reframed with commentary celebrating his calm power. His example had set a precedent. Even the smallest act of visible courage could provoke accountability and spark change. He thought about the young professionals who would watch these clips, the airline staff who had finally confronted their own biases, and the passengers who might carry this lesson forward. Each small recognition, each nod of respect, was a building block for something larger, something that might outlast any one individual. The plane lifted off, the city shrinking beneath them, the skyline a patchwork of steel and glass fading into clouds. Andre looked out the window, reflecting quietly. Change is not instantaneous, but it is cumulative. He understood the weight of his actions and the responsibility that came with being a visible example of justice in a space designed to exclude. And as the engines roared steadily, He posed a question to himself and to every viewer. If you were in a space built to deny your dignity, would you remain silent, or would you act, knowing your courage could alter not just your fate, but the system itself? If you believe these stories matter, share your voice. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was this justice, or was it overdue correction? And if you know silence is no longer an option, subscribe. Every subscription helps keep these stories alive. Every subscription makes sure the next Andre doesn't have to fight alone. Andre exhaled, a quiet satisfaction settling over him, but also a sharp awareness. The fight against systemic bias never truly ends. Even in this welcoming cabin, even in this brief moment of triumph, the world beyond the plains still contained unseen barriers, silent prejudices, and operational norms that had yet to be challenged. And that is why these stories matter. They remind us that power and dignity are not granted. They are claimed, often quietly, often under scrutiny, but always with consequences for those who attempt to enforce or resist them. And so, as the plane ascended into the endless blue, one lingering thought remained, meant to stay long after the video ends. In a world where systems are designed to comfort some and deny others, how far are you willing to go to ensure justice is not just possible, but inevitable?